All good to go. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in today. I'm happy to have Merryn Glover joining us. Thanks, Merryn, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be with you all.
So, Merryn writes fiction, drama, poetry, and journalism. In a life spent crossing cultures, she was born in Kathmandu and brought up in Nepal, India, and Pakistan. She went to university in Australia and keeps returning to South Asia and has called Scotland home for over 25 years. Her plays and short stories have been broadcast on BBC Radio 4 and Radio Scotland and widely anthologised. Her first novel, A House Called Askerville, is set in an Indian hill station where she went to school, and her second, Of Stone and Sky, in the Scottish Highlands where she lives, and it was recently awarded Book of the Year by the Bookmark Book Festival in Perthshire. And she's also currently writing The Hidden Fires, A Cargorm's Journey with Nan Shepherd. So thanks so much, Merryn, for joining us. It's great to have you joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Just wondering if you want to start off by telling us a little bit about Of Stone and Sky.
Sure, I'd love to. So this is the hardback version that came out in May of this year. And it's set in the Highlands of Scotland here where I live, in the Cairngorms National Park. And it's called that because of the Cairngorms Mountains in the middle of this national park. And it's a very special landscape with a long and somewhat troubled history, as is the case with a lot of landscapes around the world, really. So it's the story of a Highland shepherd, Colvin Munro, who disappears. And in the weeks and months that follow his disappearance, people gradually find a trail of his possessions leading up into the Cairngorms Mountains. And as his foster sister Mo and his prodigal younger brother Sorley and the community around them seek to understand why he left, these questions circle out to embrace really the whole community, the landscape, the history, and what has brought them all to this place of crisis.
And I'm wondering if maybe you've got a little bit of Stone and Sky that you want to read to us.
Yes, definitely. What I'll read actually is the very opening chapter, because then it kind of needs no backstory or explanation.
Yep, no, that's great.
It is in the voice of our foster sister, Mo, who was at one time the local minister. She now runs the village pub. The opening chapter is called Eulogy. We are gathered here today on the shores of Loch Hope, in the presence of God, in the worshipful company of birds and beasts, on the hallowed ground of the earth, to give thanks for the life of Colvin Munro. We do not know that he is dead, and without certainty and without a body, we can't, but we must release him, and we must lay ourselves to rest. There is a time to bind and a time to let go. But where to begin when it goes back so far, and where to finish when there is no end? In truth, this is the story of us all, for we knew and loved Colvin, and we drove him away. Ah, yes, we have been haunted by that fear, haven't we? Was it me? Was it my fault? And through these years, you hoped I would say, in soothing pastoral tones, no, of course not. It was nobody's fault, certainly not yours. Be at peace. But we could not find peace, could we? Because we were hiding behind shame and half lies, when what we needed was to get to the heart of the matter, the truth, if you will. And I do not presume to know the whole truth, but I do know this story. I know it, for I am part of it, and because you have told me your parts. Slowly, painfully, in these 7 years since Colvin disappeared, you have spilled your tales mainly over drinks at the ferryman, swilling sorrows into your beer, sighing regrets on whiskey breath, confessing sins in the sipping of wine. And as the truth has come out like bits of shrapnel from a wound, I have tried to piece it all together, to understand. Some of it will never make sense this side of the promised land, but of one thing I am certain. Colvin Munro is still alive.
Thanks for reading that. That was great and a great introduction. Can you tell me what genre would you class your book as?
That's a really interesting question and a really fraught one, really, isn't it? In the genre
So
wars.
I have read your book. I usually show a copy of the one I read, but I read a Kindle version of it, so aren't able to share it. But
well, I'd be really interested to turn the question around, actually, for you as a voracious reader. What genre would you put it in?
I'd say probably contemporary fiction, maybe.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Go on.
What era would you like to tell the people? It's more present day, isn't it, that it's written, just to share those people?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting comment about it being contemporary fiction, because in some ways it's also classed as historical fiction.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because it is a contemporary framework, and that opening chapter that I just read is in the present day, or I think 2017 or something to be precise. But and when I first started writing it, I just thought this is just going to be a contemporary story, because my first book did go back into the past a lot. I thought this is just a contemporary story, and in present day, this community. But as soon as I really began to write it and to recognize that so much of the story is about this community's relationship with the land, then it became clear to me that I couldn't write about the land without going back into the history, because the history tells us why we're here today, and that relationship with the land has been so troubled, and it's so important to understand why the landscape is what it is today. And so the history kind of kept pulling on me, and why had the fathers done that, and the forefathers and the mothers and so on. So
I don't think like there is a genre, but it was very geographical as well, wasn't it?
Yes, that's a really interesting reflection as well, because I think perhaps because, as you know from the intro that you gave there of me, I've moved so many times. So place is very important in my writing, and a sense of relationship with the place that you're in, the land that you're on, and sense questions around belonging. So some of the big questions this book explores is land ownership and the use of the land, and stewardship of the land. And then there's within that questions of do we own the land, or do we belong to the land? And so yes, what began as kind of contemporary fiction, and in many ways is very contemporary in some of its characters and its complexities and situations, but there is this historical bedrock that we travel back to, kind of go backwards and forwards in time through it. I suppose that the publisher also positions it as literary fiction. But again, that's what sort of genre is that? Because a lot of other genre fiction, like romantic fiction or crime fiction, is very literary in the way that it's written as well. So so a slippery genre, perhaps.
Yeah. And what sort of research did you do?
Loads. So that's my research folder.
Yeah.
And that's just what's in hard copy. There's a lot on my laptop as well. I think that's true of a lot of my writing, is that it involves a lot of research, possibly too much research, because I find it fascinating, and I can end up going down rabbit holes and reading whole books and things that are probably too much information. But I, again, because the history was very important to the story, I needed to understand that history. And the more you know you don't know. So as soon as I started writing, and really right from the beginning, there was this character of a shepherd that kind of stalked into my imagination right from the first page of notes. And immediately I had this sense of, oh, okay, so it's a story about a shepherd. But what does a shepherd do all day? So immediately there was that research. And so the research was, as I showed you there, that big fat folder, lots of reading, lots of things on the computer. But much more important was the actual meeting people and spending time with people for whom this is way of life. And because I live in a rural area, there are farmers and shepherds and landowners all around me. And so it was a case of approaching people and saying, you know, can I come and follow you? Can I come and watch what you do and ask 101 questions? And people were incredibly generous with allowing me to do that. And there was a family in particular just down the road from me who I spent a lot of time following them and their sheep really? around the hills and in and out barns and watching all sorts of procedures. And so that was the most vital and important part of the research, definitely.
And I'm wondering, in your research, is there anything that you found that you would think people watching now would find interesting that they may not find out in the book?
Yes, I suppose particularly for an Australian audience, who I think probably about half of your audience are Australians, and I'm an Australian citizen, and a big part of my heart is always in Australia. It doesn't really come out in the book in a big way because it's another whole story, but it's referenced towards the end of the book. One of the big scars on the history of Scotland is what we call the clearances, and that was where wealthy landowners, particularly in the Highlands, moved their peasant farmers off the land, cleared them off the land, and put them on a very, very poor quality land, often the coasts or the high hills, where it was extremely difficult. They couldn't make a living in those places. And the reason this happened was because at that time there was money in wool and sheep. So all these big sheep flocks were brought up from the borders area and established in the Highlands on these massive tracts of land where the people had been cleared away. And a lot of those people that had been cleared away from the land emigrated. And that was when many of them went to Australia and Canada and so on. And so in Scotland, you will often hear the story of the clearances and that travesty and that injustice. But what has perhaps not been acknowledged enough, but is emerging much more and more in recent years, is that, you know, what those people did when they went to the colonies was often exactly the same thing that had happened to them. They took land, and in some cases in terrible and brutal ways. So that reality is acknowledged later in the book, but it's not unfolded because it is a whole other story, really. But it's important to recognize that often seems to be part of a cycle of injustice.
And we've got a few people watching, which is great, and I've got some questions from people watching. Kelly said she loves the colours on your cover. Do you want to show everyone the cover again? And she wonders if you had any choice in the cover and also the title as well.
Yeah, great question. So the title, I'll start with that. I find it really hard to come up with titles, and I go through many titles. This book started, I literally started writing it in the middle of the night on the summer solstice in 2013, so quite a long time ago. And it is, of course, then the shortest night of the year. And that's particularly apparent in the Highlands of Scotland because by the time you get to the summer solstice, you don't really even get much deep darkness. You have a few hours of darkness, but the light, the sky can just continue to hold this beautiful green glow So that became the working title for the book, was The Shortest Night, for a long time. And also there's a sort of climactic point in the novel which happens on the shortest night up in the Cairngorms. But then at one point it changed to being Colvin's Walk, because the shepherd Colvin literally walks up into the mountains. And that's what it was at the point that the publisher took it on. And they said to me, "Are you wedded to that title?" And I said, "No, I'm struggling with titles." So, working on the title, at one point I was reading through the whole book again for edits, and just looking for, would there be a word or a phrase or something that might come out. And that's where Of Stone and Sky came from. And that's actually on the back of the book. Perhaps I'll just read this little bit, because it's a moment from up in the Cairngorms Mountains, and it captures this title. "And then, without warning, we stepped above the cloud and into sun. I'd never seen the like of it before. The great white sea filling the strath below, while we stood on a height of glory. We whooped and laughed and cast off our packs, startling a hare and causing a herd of deer to lift their heads. Joy was our companion for that walk, up into the corries and high passes, the wind-blown ridges and the summits of Stone and Sky."
No, that's great.
So that's the origins of the title. But I also felt, as I settled on that phrase, that it expressed not just the kind of literal realities of this landscape, but a lot of the thematic ideas in it, in which there's a sense of being incredibly grounded and earthed in this place, but there is a yearning towards something more transcendent as well, that comes through. But to the question about the cover, so this gorgeous cover, which I absolutely love, and there's this lovely gold spine as well. It was designed by designer for my publisher, Polygon Books. Her name is Abigail Salvesen. And so the publisher, my editor, sent me some drafts of the cover, and I immediately loved it. And I know for a lot of authors, it's a really heartbreaking moment when they see the cover that the publisher suggested. They think, "No, that's not my book, and I hate it," and all sorts of things. But I saw this and I loved it. But there's a few processes of backwards and forwards and figuring out different things to go in it. But yeah, I just love the way that the words actually are so rooted in the mountains there, and it captures different elements of the landscape with the mountains and the loch and the sky and the clouds, and there's some beautiful little white birds there in this ray of light, and there's some trees and an old Highland church, which is part of the story as well. So I absolutely love the cover. It's got
and the colours are so make it stand out a lot as well, doesn't they?
Absolutely.
Sarah Joy says, she said your book sounds wonderful, and she wonders where you got the idea for the plot.
Oh yeah, great question, Sarah Joy. Well, like I said, it kind of came in the middle of the night, and that's happened to me just a few times in my writing life, where I've literally been woken up out of a dream, and there's this idea. And so since I wasn't able to go back to sleep, then I just got up about 4 a.m. and went downstairs and started to write. And this is that sheet of paper where those first notes were written, and it says 4 a.m., 22nd of June 13, the shortest night. And the notes read, "A story, a land, a people. This place of beauty and history, of loss and hope. A shepherd. The struggle to maintain a way of life, a home, a family. The forces of class and entitlement, injustice and capitalism that threaten traditional relationships with the land, old ways of work, connection and community. Tensions between landowners, conservationists, shepherds and farmers, estate workers, locals and incomers. The places of coming together, the ties and the tearing apart."
No, that's great. You've got that you've kept about,
Yeah, and so you saw the research folder, then this is the folder of all the kind of ideas and plot development and the rest of it along the way. So it was a long journey. I do write very slowly, partly because of the research process, partly because of just the amount of kind of thinking and developing of an idea that goes into the book. Partly because I think I'm just slow. I'm the tortoise of the publishing world.
And do you have another job at the same time as well?
Yeah, so I guess through the development of that, I was working part-time. Sometimes that was supply teaching. So I was working part-time doing supply teaching through that. You know, a couple of kids and other writing projects as well. I tend to be juggling more than one thing at a time with writing, partly because a novel takes me so long that it's sort of important to have other things that are getting out there during that course of time. Otherwise, I, disappear. So, so it takes a long time.
Yeah.
But, ideas, in answer to the question, sometimes there's that kernel of an idea that arrives, and then it just continues to grow and develop, and then some things a bit fall away and have to be cut out, and other things arrive. So it's a really quite kind of mystical process, isn't it? The development of creative ideas, because some things seem to come to you, some things you have to work on really hard, and it's never entirely clear where it all comes through and how it grows, but somehow it does.
Yeah. And it sounds like you've led an interesting life, living in different countries, quite a wide range of cultures and that as well. Could you tell us how you became to be a writer, and did you write when you were growing up? Did you write journals of the different places you've been living in? And
yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, I think probably like most writers, it was something I loved doing from very early on. And when I was little, it was probably little poems about my cats and things like that, and not necessarily anything terribly profound. But because we traveled, and because I spent time in boarding school from age 9 to 18, a lot of the writing ended up being in letters. And my parents have kept all of the letters that I wrote to them. So rather than diaries and journals, it tended to be a lot of letter writing for a long time. I've always had a notebook on the go, or several notebooks actually. And, so that bits and pieces go in them. I'm not a very dedicated diary writer in terms of I rarely write a daily diary about what I did that day kind of thing, because I get very bored of that very quickly. But there's always notebooks where there's scraps of ideas, little bits of writing. A kind of personal spiritual journaling is something that I do as an almost daily discipline. But so there's always been different kinds of writing at different times. But that takes different forms. And I often do look back though and wish I'd kept better records of some of the places I've been and experiences. And I think it's one of the tensions in being a writer or an artist of any kind, is that on the one hand you have the experience and you need to be a part of it and immerse yourself in it to have any way of making art. But then in order to make your art, you have to withdraw to take the time to write or to make the music or the painting or whatever it is. And it can be difficult when you're loving life, or when you're very intensely involved in the life to stop and go and actually record it in some way, and I look back and think, well, some of the most intense and interesting periods of my life, I was so busy living that I hadn't stop to capture it, and I do regret that.
Yeah. And what about writing a memoir?
Oh gosh, I suppose there are bits of memoir that come into some of the other writing I do. If it's an article or the book that I'm working on at the moment is actually a response to this book, The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd, and this Nan Shepherd was writing in the 20s, 30s. She'd written novels at that time in the kind of modernist era. She's a Scottish writer from Aberdeenshire. And at the time of publishing her novels, she was quite celebrated, but then kind of went into it became invisible, really, wasn't really recognized very much. But The Living Mountain, she actually wrote during the Second World War about the Cairngorms Mountains. And this book has become increasingly celebrated in recent years, and rightly so. It's come into recognition. And so the work I'm doing at the moment is writing a contemporary response to her work, because I'm another woman all these years later, living, walking, writing in the Cairngorms. So there are some elements of memoir that come into that book because I'm writing about my experiences of the mountains here, but also there's a bit of reference back to the fact that I grew up in the Himalayas, so it's a very different kind of mountain range, and my journey from that sort of mountain range to this sort of mountain range. So a little bit of memoir comes through in that, but I think writing memoir and autobiography is really challenging because it's never just your story. It's other people's stories as well, and there are a huge number of dilemmas in that process, and I'm not sure I've got the courage for that.
Yeah. And could you tell us what you like to read yourself? And I'm wondering if maybe you've read anything lately you could recommend to us.
Yes, of course. Well, first and foremost, The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd it's actually a really short book. It's only 30,000 words, and it's utterly beautiful. Because it's not just a description of the mountains and her walking in them, but it's philosophy as well, but written in a way that uses no academic language or anything like that. It's just a very beautiful and increasingly deep exploration of what it means to be, So I really recommend that. Because of that work and that research, I'm also reading a lot of other books about the Cairngorms, the natural history of the Cairngorms, and all sorts of other writers who've explored them. And because Nan Shepherd's journey into the mountains, and I suppose my own is in some respect a philosophical and spiritual journey, I've been really interested in other people's journeys into mountains and why they've done them. So I really enjoyed Colin Thubron's To a Mountain in Tibet, about Mount Kailash and doing the circuit of Kailash. Because I am also really interested in landscape and place and people's relationships to their land, I was really, really interested on one of my trips back to Australia. I think it must have been in about 2017. My aunt, who's a great reader, thank you, Alice, had recommended Position Doubtful by Kim Mahood, so Australian readers might be particularly interested in that. The subtitle is Mapping Landscapes and Memories, and it's an extraordinary work reflecting on her experiences in the central deserts of Australia, and the different ways in which people map those landscapes, herself as an artist, geologists, the indigenous peoples there, and the ways in which those stories and maps of place perhaps overlap or conflict. Absolutely beautifully written book. I also love poetry. So 100 Lockdown Sonnets by Jacqueline Safra, loaned to me by a friend. I felt was one of the best pieces of writing that I'd come across. It just captured very much the UK lockdown experience, like it references some of the news headlines and things that we had here. So it would be a very different collection that you folks would be reading, whether in Australia or the US or India or wherever, because everyone's lockdown experiences have been unique, lots of commonalities, but so no, and then lots of fiction. I suppose I read a lot of my fiction on Kindle now, so I can't wave those ones around, but more recently read Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I found fascinating. So I'm a complete, very eclectic in my reading habits. I'll read all kinds of different things.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those recommendations. Mary wonders if you have any authors who have inspired your writing.
Oh gosh, lots. I just am always interested to look at the different ways people crack this nut of trying to write fiction, and there's so many different ways to approach it. And so I'm always just fascinated exploring and discovering different ways in which people have told the story. when I wrote my first novel, that's it there, A House Called Askaval, which is set in the mountains of North India. At the time, so I obviously have loved writing out of India as well. So Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children and Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. And so these books inspire, but they can really intimidate you as well because they're such extraordinary, Booker Prize winning books, Anita Desai, Clear Light of Day. So these are books that you read and I return to and just think, how did they do that?
Yeah.
So yeah, all writing is useful. And I guess the older you get, the more you realize I'm never, ever going to be able to read all the books out there that I want to read. So I suppose I do kind of become more and more selective. But I just love the richness of the so many different ways in which people find to tell a story, and I guess I'm inspired and challenged by all of those.
No, that's a great answer. I'm wondering if you've got any advice you could give to a new writer.
Go for it. I think I don't know if people are aware of Anne Lamott's work on writing. She's written a fantastic book called Bird by Bird. And I would encourage people to read that if you're keen on writing. And one of the things that she makes clear in that, because she's done a lot of teaching of writing, is that writing is really good for us. And go and write, do that. You will find that rewarding and fulfilling. Trying to get published is not always good for us. And that's the challenge, because I think most writers want readers. And so I think, it can be a really difficult journey to work out the best way to find your readers. But I would say that if you're a new writer, start that with a supportive group of readers, say in a group, a writing group, or with 2 or 3 writing buddies. I've had those things and really appreciated them, and I'm still in close contact with some of these writing buddies. And then in time, you might find the places where your writing finds a good home. And I suppose in some ways, the internet has made that easier and easier for people. There's all kinds of online sites and blogs and things like that, where you might be able to share your work. And of course, there's the whole independent publishing world as well that has opened things up tremendously. But it is challenging to get published in the traditional sense of that. And for some people, that's a really important route. For other people, it isn't. And so you can get yourself tied up into all sorts of knots trying to pursue that. So I would go back to Anne Lamott's advice, just really focus on the actual writing and dedicate yourself to telling your story or your poem, your play, whatever it is, to the best of your ability, and finding the people that you want to share that with, who will enjoy it and receive it and welcome it. And let that creative exchange be the ground of what you're doing, rather than getting too distracted and tied up with external publishing. That's a long way down the road.
Well, thanks for sharing that advice. Just want to say thanks so much for talking to me today. Wondering if you can share with people watching how they could keep in touch with you.
Yeah, I'd be delighted. So my website is www.merrynglover.com, and there's an email address there for emailing me if you'd like to do that. I am also on social media. I'm always at Merryn Glover. I haven't yet discovered another Merryn Glover out in the world, so it seems to be pretty easy to find me. So I am on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and my website kind of gives you all of those different ways of getting in touch as well, and a bit more of the story of what I'm up to. And I do send out a newsletter, so that's probably the best way for people to find out when new books are coming out, or stories or articles or other things like that, and events I'm doing like this one. Increasingly, I suppose that's been one of the silver linings of lockdown, is that we've learned how great it is to be in touch through this kind of technology. So, and you've done a wonderful job by just bringing people together all around the world around books. So that's been great, Jackie. And so increasingly the events and things I'm doing do have that element to them. So wherever people are in the world, they can be in touch and tap in on some of these opportunities. So signing up for my newsletter is a great way to be in touch. Yeah, thank you.
No, that's great. Thanks. And just want to thank everyone who joined in, and thanks for the questions that people asked.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, folks. I can't see your faces, unfortunately, but thank you for coming and giving your time to this.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Jackie. Bye-bye.